The first Monday morning of the new semester at Jefferson High School in Colorado Springs, Colorado, began with unexpected news. Their history teacher had suffered a medical emergency over the weekend, and the school had found a substitute to cover classes for several weeks. As students filed into room 214, they expected another temporary teacher who would spend the morning reading lesson plans and showing documentaries until the regular teacher returned. Instead, they found an 80-year-old man quietly arranging a stack of worn leather notebooks on the front desk. He wore a neatly pressed brown tweed jacket with elbow patches, a light blue dress shirt, a burgundy tie, polished black shoes, and thin silver-framed glasses. Resting beside the notebooks was an old leather briefcase, a brass fountain pen, and a smooth walnut walking cane. Before the bell rang, he slowly walked around the classroom, carefully reading the names written on every desk as if he wanted to know each student before speaking a single word. Several students exchanged amused smiles. One whispered, "He's probably never even used a smartboard." Another laughed, "This is going to be the easiest class all semester." A third student quietly placed earbuds beneath his hoodie. Substitute teachers never notice. The elderly man simply smiled as if he had heard every word. When the bell rang, he wrote only one sentence across the whiteboard in perfect handwriting. Education is not about memorizing answers. It is about learning how to ask better questions. Without introducing himself, he looked around the room and asked, "Before we begin, who here believes history is the most boring subject in school?" Nearly half the class raised their hands. The old man nodded with genuine interest. "Excellent," he said warmly. "Then today will be far more interesting than I expected." Soft laughter filled the room. One confident senior leaned back in his chair and said, "No offense, sir, but you're just the substitute." The elderly teacher smiled kindly. "You're absolutely right." He picked up the piece of chalk again. "Today, I am." Just then, Principal Emily Carter quietly stepped into the classroom carrying a folder she had forgotten to deliver. She looked toward the elderly man, paused for a moment, and smiled with unmistakable respect. "Class," she said, "before I leave, I should properly introduce your substitute teacher." Every student turned toward the front of the room. "This is Mr. William Bill Anderson." She paused, before continuing. "For 30 years, he taught American history in this state. During that time, he was named Colorado Teacher of the Year multiple times, received the National Teacher of the Year Lifetime Excellence Award, mentored hundreds of teachers, and helped shape the curriculum still being taught in classrooms across Colorado today." Complete silence filled room 214. The students slowly looked back at the quiet old man standing beside the whiteboard. Only seconds earlier, they had seen an elderly substitute teacher. Now they realized they were standing in front of one of the most respected educators of his generation. Resting inside the worn leather briefcase on his desk was a collection of handwritten lesson journals spanning nearly 50 years, along with one sealed letter from the principal who had first hired him as a young teacher, with a single instruction that had guided his entire career: never teach the lesson, teach the student, and the lesson will never be forgotten. Before the final bell rang that afternoon, an entire classroom would discover why the greatest teachers are remembered not for the facts they explain, but for the lives they quietly change. The first period bell echoed through Jefferson High School as students casually wandered into room 214, expecting another ordinary Monday. Rumors had already spread through the hallways that their history teacher, Mrs. Laura Bennett, had undergone emergency surgery over the weekend and would be away for several weeks. For most of the students, that meant only one thing: an easy month with a substitute teacher. Laughter filled the classroom as backpacks dropped onto the floor, phones disappeared beneath desks, and conversations continued long after the warning bell had sounded. Standing quietly at the front of the room was an 80-year-old man wearing a neatly pressed brown tweed jacket with dark elbow patches, a light blue dress shirt, a burgundy tie, polished black shoes, and thin silver-framed glasses. Resting beside him were a weathered leather briefcase, several worn notebooks whose edges had softened with age, a brass fountain pen, and a polished walnut walking cane leaning against the teacher's desk. Without saying a word, the elderly man slowly walked between the rows of desks, reading every student's name tag with genuine interest. Before returning to the front of the classroom, several students exchanged amused glances. One whispered, "I bet he still writes report cards by hand." Another quietly laughed. "There's no way he even knows how to use the smartboard." A third student slipped one earbud beneath his hoodie. Relax, he smiled. Substitute teachers never notice. The elderly man calmly placed a piece of white chalk on the tray beneath the board before writing one sentence in remarkably elegant handwriting. Education is not about memorizing answers. It is about learning how to ask better questions. He turned toward the class with a gentle smile. Good morning. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. He looked around the room. How many of you believe history is the most boring subject you'll ever study? Nearly half the class immediately raised their hands. A few students even laughed while looking around to see how many agreed. The old man nodded thoughtfully. Wonderful, he said. That means none of you have actually been taught history yet. Curious murmurs spread across the room. One senior named Tyler Reynolds leaned back in his chair, with his arms folded across his chest. No offense, sir, he said confidently. But you're just filling in until the real teacher comes back. A few students quietly laughed in agreement. The elderly man smiled without the slightest sign of irritation. You're absolutely right, he replied warmly. Today, I am your substitute teacher. He picked up another piece of chalk and drew a small circle in the center of the board. Now let me ask a different question. He pointed at the circle. Who can tell me what this is? A circle, one student answered immediately. The old man nodded. Perhaps? He smiled again. Or perhaps it's the top of a cannon, or the wheel of a wagon crossing the American frontier, or the button on Abraham Lincoln's coat, or maybe... He paused. It's simply the beginning of a story. The room became noticeably quieter. For the first time that morning, several students lowered their phones. Before the lesson could continue, the classroom door opened. Principal Emily Carter stepped inside, carrying a blue folder. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said. I forgot to give our substitute today's schedule. She walked toward the teacher's desk, then stopped beside the elderly man with a warm smile that immediately caught everyone's attention. Good morning, Mr. Anderson. Without hesitation, she extended both hands to greet him. It's an honor to have you back. The students exchanged puzzled looks. Carter turned toward the class. Before I leave, I think all of you deserve a proper introduction. She looked proudly toward the elderly teacher. Class, this is Mr. William Bill Anderson. She paused for a moment before continuing. For 30 years, he taught history right here in Colorado. During his career, he received Colorado's Teacher of the Year Award multiple times, earned the National Teacher of the Year Lifetime Excellence Award, trained hundreds of educators, and helped design many of the history programs still used in schools across this state today. Every sound inside room 214 disappeared. Tyler slowly lowered his arms. The student wearing the hidden earbud quietly pulled it out. Several classmates stared at the elderly man standing peacefully beside the whiteboard. Only moments earlier, they had seen nothing more than an old substitute teacher. Now they realized they were standing before one of the most respected educators their school had ever welcomed. William gently closed his weathered leather briefcase before looking around the room with the same calm smile. Now, he said softly, shall we find out why history has been waiting your entire lives to meet you? Not a single student spoke after Principal Emily Carter left the classroom. The laughter that had filled room 214 only minutes earlier had completely disappeared. Replaced by an unfamiliar curiosity, William Anderson looked around the room without mentioning the awards or the introduction they had just heard. Instead, he quietly erased the circle from the whiteboard and wrote a single date beneath it. April 19, 1775. He turned back to the class. Can anyone tell me what happened on this day? Several students searched their memories, but no hands went up. William smiled gently. That's perfectly fine. He walked slowly to the center of the room. Close your laptops. The students obeyed almost instinctively. Put your phones away. Even Tyler Reynolds quietly slipped his phone into his backpack. William nodded with satisfaction. Now imagine this classroom no longer exists. His voice became calm and deliberate. Imagine you're standing on a dirt road outside a small town called Lexington, Massachusetts. The sun hasn't fully risen yet. The air is cold. Your hands are shaking because somewhere in the distance you hear boots striking the road in perfect rhythm. Without raising his voice, William began walking slowly between the rows of desks. You aren't reading history anymore. He looked from one student to another. You're living it. The room became completely silent. You're 17 years old, he continued. The same age as many of you sitting here today. You kissed your mother goodbye before sunrise because someone told you British soldiers were marching toward your town. You don't know whether you'll be alive by lunchtime. Several students leaned forward without realizing it. William stopped beside Tyler's desk. "Tyler," he asked quietly, "if someone handed you a musket right now and told you to defend your family, would you know what to do?" Tyler hesitated before shaking his head. "No, sir." William nodded. Neither did most of the boys standing on Lexington Green that morning. He walked toward another student. "Emily, how old are you?" 17. "Then you would have been old enough to watch your father leave home, not knowing whether he would ever return." Emily lowered her eyes. William continued moving through the classroom, speaking not like a lecturer, but like a storyteller, inviting everyone into another century. By the time he described the first gunshot of the American Revolution, no student was looking at a phone, no one was whispering. Even the hallway noise outside seemed to disappear. When he finished, he quietly picked up a faded leather notebook from his briefcase. The cover had become worn after decades of use. He carefully opened it. Inside were handwritten lesson plans, sketches, newspaper clippings, letters from former students, and pages filled with notes dating back nearly 50 years. Between two pages rested an old black and white photograph. William held it up for the class to see. It showed a much younger version of himself, standing in front of another classroom, surrounded by smiling teenagers. "This photograph," he said softly, "was taken on my very first day as a teacher in 1976. He smiled as memories returned. "I thought the hardest part of teaching would be explaining history." He gently turned the photograph over. "I was wrong." Tyler raised his hand for the first time that morning. "What was the hardest part?" William looked at him with a warm smile. "Convincing students that history was really about them?" The classroom remained silent as William reached into the back pocket of the notebook. Carefully folded inside was a yellowed envelope whose edges had softened with age. Across the front, written in blue ink, were only a few words, "For Bill. Open this only after you discover whether your students remember your lessons, or remember how you made them believe in themselves." William rested his hand gently on the unopened letter before sliding it back into the notebook. One curious student asked, "Who wrote that?" William smiled quietly. "The principal who gave me my very first classroom." At that moment, another knock came at the classroom door. The school secretary stepped inside carrying a small package. "Mr. Anderson," she said with a smile, "this was delivered to the office for you this morning." William looked surprised. The return address simply read, "Class of 1998. He looked at the package for several seconds before quietly whispering, "After all these years." The students exchanged curious glances, not realizing that before the school day ended, they would discover why hundreds of former students from across the country still called William Anderson every year on the first day of school, and why one simple package from nearly 3 decades ago would reveal the true reason he had never measured success by trophies, awards, or titles, but by the lives forever changed inside classrooms, just like room 214. The classroom remained unusually quiet as William Anderson looked down at the small package resting in his hands. The return address read only 4 words, "Class of 1998. He smiled gently before setting it on the teacher's desk without opening it. "We'll come back to this later," he said. "Right now, history is waiting." A few students leaned forward with obvious curiosity, but no one interrupted. For the first time all morning, every phone had disappeared beneath the desks. Every laptop remained closed, and every pair of eyes followed the elderly teacher as he slowly walked across the room. William picked up a piece of chalk and drew 2 identical doors on the whiteboard. Above the first, he wrote facts. Above the second, he wrote people. He turned toward the class. "If I asked you to choose only one of these doors, which would you open?" Most students immediately pointed toward the door labeled people. William smiled. "Exactly." He tapped the board gently. "History has never been about dates. Dates are simply the addresses where human stories happened." He erased the word facts, leaving only people. "The moment you understand the people," he continued, "you'll never struggle to remember the dates again." Tyler Reynolds slowly raised his hand. "Sir, can I ask you something?" William nodded. "Of course." Tyler hesitated for a moment. "If you won all those teaching awards, why did you come back as a substitute teacher?" The classroom became silent again. William looked out the window toward the football field before answering, "Because classrooms are the only places where I ever felt completely at home." He smiled softly. "Retirement took away my schedule." He looked back at the students. "It never took away my purpose." No one laughed this time. William walked back to his desk and gently opened the package from the class of 1998. Inside rested a worn attendance book, dozens of handwritten letters tied together with a blue ribbon, and a framed class photograph taken nearly 30 years earlier. As he lifted the photograph, several students noticed signatures covering the white border. At the bottom, someone had written, "The teacher who taught us that our future was always more important than our grades." William quietly laughed to himself. "I haven't seen this picture in years." He unfolded one of the letters and looked at the class. "May I read part of it?" Every student nodded. The letter began, "Dear Mr. Anderson, 30 years ago I sat in the last row of your classroom believing I wasn't smart enough to graduate. You never argued with me. You simply kept asking questions until I discovered the answers myself. Today I'm a history professor, and every semester I hear your voice reminding me that students remember encouragement long after they've forgotten lectures." William lowered the letter. Another followed. "You were the first teacher who learned every student's name before teaching a single lesson." Then another. "You came to my basketball games even when I never made it onto the court." Another. "You told me failing one test would never define the rest of my life." The room grew quieter with every letter. Several students glanced down at their desks, realizing that none of the stories, every memory was about kindness, belief, patience, and encouragement. William carefully placed the letters back inside the box before opening his weathered leather notebook. Tucked between the final pages remained the same unopened envelope from the principal who had hired him in 1976. Tyler looked at it curiously. "Is that another letter?" William nodded. "Yes. Why haven't you opened it?" William rested his hand gently across the envelope. "Because he asked me to wait until I knew whether students remembered what I taught, or remembered who they became while sitting in my classroom." At that moment, the classroom door opened once again. Principal Emily Carter quietly stepped inside carrying a laptop. "Mr. Anderson," she said with a smile. "I'm sorry to interrupt." She connected the laptop to the classroom projector. "I think your former students wanted this class to see something." The screen suddenly filled with dozens of faces joining a live video call from around the country. Doctors, engineers, teachers, firefighters, military officers, artists, judges, business owners, and parents all smiled as soon as William looked up. One after another, they greeted him with exactly the same words. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson." Then one former student smiled through tears before speaking for everyone. "You probably think you taught us history." She gently shook her head. "The truth is, you taught us how to believe that our own story mattered too." Not a single student spoke after the video call ended. Even after the projector screen faded to black, the classroom remained completely silent. Many of the students had expected to hear stories about championships, scholarships, or academic awards. Instead, they had listened to doctors, firefighters, judges, teachers, military officers, and parents describe a man who had quietly changed the direction of their lives simply by believing in them before they believed in themselves. Principal Emily Carter slowly disconnected the projector before turning toward William Anderson with a warm smile. "Bill," she said softly, "I think they've earned it." William looked at the weathered leather notebook resting on his desk. His fingers gently touched the yellowed envelope that had remained unopened for nearly 50 years. He smiled quietly. "I believe you're right." Every student leaned forward as William carefully lifted the envelope from between the notebook's final pages. The paper had become fragile with age, and the handwriting across the front had faded but remained perfectly readable. "For Bill, open this only after you discover whether your students remember your lessons, or remember how you made them believe in themselves." William slowly broke the seal for the first time. Inside rested several handwritten pages from Principal Charles Henderson, the man who had hired him as a 29-year-old first-year teacher in 1976. William unfolded the letter and began reading aloud. "Dear Bill, if you are reading this letter, then enough years have passed for you to answer the only question that truly matters in education. Did your students remember what you taught, or did they remember how you made them feel about themselves?" The room remained perfectly still. William continued, "There will always be teachers who know more history than you, who lecture more brilliantly than you, and who prepare students for examinations more efficiently than you. Never compete with them. Compete only with the teacher you were yesterday." Several students quietly lowered their eyes. William turned the page. "One day, education will become faster, computers will enter every classroom, information will become available in seconds. Artificial intelligence will answer questions that once required hours of research, welcome every improvement, but never forget something no machine will ever replace. A student will always remember the adult who believed in them at the exact moment they were beginning to doubt themselves. Emily Carter quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. William reached the final page. When your career ends, no one will remember every lesson you taught. Neither will you. But somewhere, a former student will become a kinder parent because of your patience, a better doctor because of your encouragement, a more honest judge because of your integrity, a more compassionate teacher because of your example. That will be your real curriculum, and it will continue long after you leave your classroom for the final time. William slowly folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. For several moments, no one moved. Finally, Tyler Reynolds stood from his desk. "Mr. Anderson," he said quietly, "this morning, I called you just the substitute." William looked at him with the same gentle smile he had worn all day. Tyler lowered his head. "I'm sorry." William walked over and placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "Tyler," he said softly, "the best students aren't the ones who never make mistakes." He smiled warmly. "They're the ones who are willing to grow after making them." Just then, Principal Carter stepped toward the front of the room, carrying another folder. "There's one more thing," she said. She carefully removed a framed certificate from inside. Across the top were the words Jefferson High School Hall of Honor. Beneath them was a newly engraved inscription announcing that the school's library would officially be renamed the William Anderson Learning Center, honoring nearly 5 decades of extraordinary service to education and the countless lives transformed through his teaching. The entire class immediately rose to its feet. No one had been asked to applaud, yet the room filled with a standing ovation that continued for several minutes. William looked around at the students with quiet gratitude before resting one hand on the old leather notebook. "Awards," he said gently, "eventually gather dust." He looked at every face in the room. "But the confidence you give, another human being, can keep changing the world long after both of you are gone." The final bell rang that afternoon, but for the first time all semester, not a single student rushed toward the classroom door. Backpacks remained on the floor, chairs stayed where they were, and dozens of teenagers who normally counted the seconds until dismissal simply stood quietly, looking at the elderly man who had walked into room 214 that morning as nothing more than a substitute teacher. William Anderson slowly closed his weathered leather notebook and placed Colonel Henderson's letter carefully back inside before returning it to the worn leather briefcase that had accompanied him through nearly 50 years of teaching. He smiled as he looked around the room. "Well," he said warmly, "I believe our first history lesson has come to an end." Tyler Reynolds slowly stood from his seat. "No, sir," he replied. "I don't think this was a history lesson." Several classmates nodded in agreement. "Then what was it?" William asked with a gentle smile. Tyler looked around the classroom before answering. "I think it was a lesson about people." A quiet smile spread across William's face. "Then you've already learned the most important part of history." Just then, Principal Emily Carter returned. Carrying a small wooden box, she placed it gently on the teacher's desk before turning toward the class. "There's something Mr. Anderson doesn't know," she said. William looked surprised. Emily carefully opened the box. Inside rested hundreds of handwritten letters collected over the previous 2 weeks from former students who had learned he would be returning to Jefferson High School for the first time since retiring. Some letters came from doctors, others from firefighters, engineers, police officers, soldiers, business owners, musicians, teachers, and parents. The earliest had been written more than 30 years ago. The newest had arrived that very morning. Emily picked up one envelope at random and began reading. "Dear Mr. Anderson, I honestly don't remember every date you taught us in American history. I don't remember every assignment or every quiz, but I remember the afternoon you stayed after school because I told you I wasn't smart enough to go to college. You looked at me and said, 'Never confuse where you are today with who you're capable of becoming tomorrow.' Last month, I graduated from medical school. I carried those words with me every single day." Emily reached for another letter. "You once told our class that every student deserved at least one adult who believed in them before they believed in themselves. Thank you for being that person for me." Another followed. "When my father died during my sophomore year, you never treated me differently. You simply kept reminding me that difficult chapters are never the end of the story." By the time Emily finished reading, many students in room 214 quietly wiped tears from their eyes. William himself stood speechless. He had spent a lifetime writing encouragement inside report cards, lesson plans, and notebooks, never imagining that decades later, those same words would return to him through the lives of the students who had carried them into the world. Emily smiled warmly before unveiling one final surprise. The Jefferson School Board met this morning. She looked proudly toward William. Beginning next semester, every new teacher hired by this school district will attend a special orientation called the Anderson Teaching Fellowship. The students immediately applauded. Emily continued. Before entering their own classrooms, every new teacher will spend one afternoon studying your lesson journals, reading these letters, and learning the philosophy that guided your entire career. She then uncovered a bronze plaque prepared for the new program. Across the center were engraved the words, "The Anderson Teaching Fellowship," established in honor of William Bill Anderson, whose greatest achievement was never the awards he received, but the confidence he inspired in generations of students. Great teachers do not simply prepare students for examinations, they prepare them for life. William quietly looked at the plaque before turning back to the class one final time. "Do you know something?" he asked softly. "People often congratulated me for being named Teacher of the Year." He smiled gently, "But I never believed that award belonged to me." The students listened carefully. Every time one of my students became an honest leader, a compassionate parent, a courageous firefighter, a dedicated doctor, a thoughtful teacher, or simply a kind human being, he paused as emotion filled his voice. That was the real award. The room fell silent once more. Years later, after William Anderson passed away peacefully at the age of 93, every teacher beginning their career in the Jefferson School District started their first day inside the William Anderson Learning Center. Before learning classroom management, lesson planning, educational technology, or curriculum standards, they first read Principal Charles Henderson's letter, studied William's handwritten lesson journals, and listened to recordings from the former students whose lives had been changed inside room 214. Above the entrance to the fellowship room, a final inscription welcomed every future educator. Students may forget the lesson you taught on Tuesday. They may forget the test they took on Friday, but they will never forget the teacher who convinced them they were capable of becoming more than they ever imagined. Most visitors saw old notebooks, faded photographs, worn letters, and a lifetime of teaching awards displayed behind glass. Those who understood the full story saw something far greater. They saw thousands of lives forever changed because one quiet teacher chose, every single morning, to teach the student before teaching the subject, proving that the greatest educators are remembered not for the knowledge they deliver, but for the hope they leave behind. In every classroom they enter, the story of William Bill Anderson quickly spread far beyond the walls of Jefferson High School. A short video recorded by one of the students during his first day as a substitute teacher, showing a classroom that began with laughter and ended in a standing ovation, was shared millions of times across social media. Teachers from every corner of the country wrote to say they had rediscovered why they had chosen education in the first place. Parents thanked him for reminding them that a child's confidence is often shaped by a single encouraging adult. Former students, some who had not spoken to him in decades, began writing letters once again, not to thank him for teaching history, but for teaching them how to believe in themselves. Several months later, Jefferson High School invited William back for the graduation ceremony. This time, he did not stand behind a classroom desk. Instead, he stood at the podium as the graduating class welcomed him with another standing ovation before he had spoken a single word. Looking across hundreds of young faces preparing to begin the next chapter of their lives, he smiled with the same quiet kindness that had defined his entire career. "I've been called Teacher of the Year many times," he began. "But the truth is, no teacher becomes great alone. Every student who chooses honesty over shortcuts, courage over fear, kindness over cruelty, and curiosity over comfort gives their teacher the greatest reward imaginable." He paused, allowing the silence to settle over the auditorium. "If you remember only one thing after today," he continued, "remember this. Success is measured by what you achieve. Character is measured by who you help become successful after you. Never underestimate the power of believing in another person. Sometimes, one sentence of encouragement can echo through someone's entire lifetime." When the ceremony ended, hundreds of graduates crossed the stage to receive their diplomas. Many of them stopped for just a moment after shaking the principal's hand, walking toward William to thank him personally. Some had only known him for a single day. Yet they spoke as though they were saying goodbye to a teacher they had known for years. Long after the applause faded and the chairs were folded away, one image remained hanging inside the William Anderson Learning Center. It was not a photograph of him receiving an award, nor one of the many plaques and trophies he had earned throughout his remarkable career. Instead, it was a simple picture taken on that unforgettable morning in room 214. An elderly substitute teacher stood smiling beside a whiteboard, while a classroom full of students listened with complete attention, discovering that the greatest lessons are never written in textbooks. Beneath that photograph, a bronze plaque carried the words that would guide every teacher who entered the building. A great teacher is not remembered because every student recalls every lesson. A great teacher is remembered because every student leaves believing they can write a better story for their own life. And perhaps that was William Anderson's greatest achievement, not the awards he received, not the titles he earned, not even the generations of educators he inspired. His greatest achievement was that thousands of ordinary people spent the rest of their lives believing they were capable of becoming extraordinary simply because, many years earlier, one quiet teacher had believed it first.